thank you so much for joining the Curlew Action webinar on predators and curlews. It's a subject that we will keep visiting lots of times. It's one of those huge issues where we can look at it from lots of different points of view and bring in very many different people who are associated with this. So this won't be a single attempt at it. We will be doing it again and again, but delighted that you can join us this evening. So before we start, please could you put your questions in the chat as we go along? Just put your questions in there and the people behind the scenes will gather them up and make sure we get them at the end of the session, which would be fantastic. If you feel you can support Curlew Action to put on these webinars, please do. We'd be delighted. And Megan will put in the chat the link to our donate page. So thank you for that. But I am absolutely delighted this evening to bring to you two of our presenters. We are waiting for a third who I know is trying to get onto the call, and I don't know where she is at the moment. But let me introduce, first of all, Professor Steve Carver from Leeds University, and also Dr. David Jarrett. And David, forgive me, are you still at Stirling or have you left Stirling now?
I'm back with BTO Scotland.
BTO Scotland. Okay, yeah. Fantastic. So these Steve and David are going to present their points of view on predator control in curlews. And then we have a further presenter who I hope will have joined us by then to talk about how do we balance different points of views in conservation. But let's start our conversation with just a quick roundup. We know that curlews are in serious trouble. We know that two of the main drivers of their decline are, well, the main driver of their decline is their failure to produce enough young to reproduce the population. So it's the breeding season where all the problems really occur. And we know that the two big problems they face are predation and mainly habitat disruption in terms of agricultural activities and so on. We know that's the case. So we know that predation is a major driver of curlew reproductive problem. Most eggs and chicks get eaten, and they are reproducing at way too slow a rate to be able to maintain a stable population. So that raises the questions, what do we do about predators? It's one of the biggest questions in conservation, particularly when it comes to ground nesting birds. The main predators of curlews are foxes and crows, native birds and mammals to this country. So should we be controlling native creatures to help another native creature? And if we should, how do we do it? How long? Who does it? Or should you just say, no, that isn't the right approach? There are other things we should be doing instead. That's the kind of discussion I'd like us to have tonight. So without further ado, I am going to pass on to, first of all, to Steve Carver from Leeds University to tell us what he feels about the predator conundrum. Over to you, Steve.
So yeah, thanks Mary, thanks Roger for inviting me this evening. I know not everybody will agree with what I've got to say, but you know, it's good to put those questions out there, I think. But I do want to present some. Well, I was asked to present some work that we've been doing with partners in the North Pennines National Landscape, formerly AONB, and Northumberland County Council, on trying to resolve the problems associated with upland woodland, gill woodland, and curlew predation, or predation on curlews, we should say. So there's an issue here. So we all know, I think, that what the curlew habitat preferences are, and I've stolen this slide from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, as you can see down the bottom there. I put a little red line through the managed bit because I think, you know, heather had been managed for many years, but curlew were here before we were here to manage the heather, certainly in the level of management that we see today. So we all know that they like heather, they like, you know, the sort of marshy, wet areas and that medium length vegetation and rough pastures, etc. And I think that's important background. I'm sure everybody who's logged on is well aware of this, but also well aware of the fact that as you introduced, that curlew populations are not doing great. But if we look back at the trends over time, back to the 1970s, when they were still on the quarry list and were still being shot, there was a decline present then. And when that shooting ceased, the populations did rebound a certain amount. But then since the late 90s, early noughties have started to decline again. And that kind of says to me that it's not just about shooting and shooting practices, that there's an underlying cause here. And of course, the longer term trend, well, or rather shorter term trend, 1994 onwards, is just showing a continued decline. But it's not quite reached the level that we saw in the mid 70s. If we look at spatial patterns, breeding abundance, then they are largely confined to some of the upland areas and some of those areas of rough grass. Although some interesting coastal patterns as well, with this work from BTO on breeding abundance change showing. I'm kind of looking at that red circle there, thinking what's happening in Thetford Forest. So our work, we were asked by, initially by North Pennines, AONB as then was, now National Landscape, and latterly by Northumberland County Council, to look to see if we can reconcile some of these potential conflicts between upland gill woodland and the ecosystem service benefits that they provide in terms of nutrient stripping, erosion control, flood mitigation, biodiversity, etc., and the threat from avian predators using mature trees in upland landscapes to overlook areas important for ground nesting birds. So very much a case of potentially wrong trees in the wrong place if you're thinking about large-scale conifer plantation. And there's been plenty of examples of that in the uplands over the past tens of years, at least 100 years. And this requirement or a perceived need for more trees in the uplands, and again, it is a question of right tree, right place. So again, just two contrasting stories here from Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Wrong tree in the wrong place, but then also in a recent report on the uplands, upland managers saying, well, we have to integrate tree planting into the grouse moor management. So there's an example there from Lindsay Waddle, and looking at some trees he's planted there 30 odd years ago. The Forest Commission has a predator shadow model, which again probably all aware of. It's simply one of these simple buffer model, buffering existing areas of woodland, and looking at potential areas for new woodland creation, which sit within the buffer, but then don't increase the area which has a so-called predator shadow. Very, very simple model, but it's a good place to start. What we were asked to do for the North Pennines, AONB, National Landscape, and the Northumberland National Park, under the auspices of Northumberland County Council, was answer this question, which was, they have targets for woodland creation, biodiversity, etc. And so they were asking us, where can we target areas for new gill woodland with associated benefits for biodiversity, runoff, erosion control, etc. And this is the critical thing, such that the resulting mature trees don't provide avian predators with perches overlooking areas important for ground nesting birds, obviously including curlew. And this is not a simple question to ask, because predicting looking at opportunities for new gill woodland is not that particularly straightforward enough. But then the question is, when those trees mature, which are the areas which are then covered by that extra predator shadow, if you like? That's the tricky question. So yeah, here we go. A tricky question requires a tricky model. So I'll just briefly take you through this. So we had a model which was identifying where the gills were. So we took terrain data, we did some flow accumulation modeling and to derive hydrological networks, and then we did a slope divided by Euclidean distance to stream. So the steeper the slope, closer to the stream, there's your gill. Pretty straightforward. we used a slope model then to identify the areas, or one of the criteria was potential areas for ground nesting birds. So BTO and others say less than 8 degrees slope, so that's pretty straightforward as well. And then a land suitability model. So depending on the existing land cover, we used the living landscapes data from Natural England there. We reclassified that into potentially suitable land cover types simply by extracting and removing all of the urban areas, the areas of existing woodland, and areas of open water, and then most of the other areas in upland areas are potentially suitable on that basis. This is the tricky bit, in that we then had to identify areas above the break of slope, which then with less than 8 degrees and suitable land cover could be classified as being potentially suitable ground nesting bird habitat, and then do a viewshed analysis. And one of those basically says, what can you see from where? And we added in a 10-meter offset to allow for a mature tree in an upland landscape as a sort of broad height offset. And that's the perch height, for a potential avian predator. We were then able to integrate a sort of predator model based on that visibility analysis to derive what we were calling panic zones, Curlew panic zones, and then present the results as a series of gills, which, if planted with trees, or if natural regeneration was allowed to take place with that 10-meter tree height in when those trees mature, still don't provide avian predators with a view or an overlook over areas potentially important for ground nesting birds. So apologies for the complexity of that, but you can see the sort of stages of gill model, slope model, land suitability model, what you can see from where, the predator model, and then that allows us to identify the locations of gill woodland which wouldn't have an impact or less impact on ground nesting bird areas. So it's one of those kind of classic conflict models. So yeah, Northumberland in red and the North Pennines National Landscape in the blue here. That yellow box there is just some maps that I'm going to show you. It would be pointless showing you all of the data for the whole area because it's so large and you wouldn't see the detail. So I'm just giving you some zoom in maps in that yellow box there. No reason particularly for choosing that yellow box other than it had some variability in it. So this is what the landscape looks like in a satellite image. We can see some open areas, we can see some coniferous woodland, and we can see 1 or 2 areas of existing native woodland in there as well. And we can obviously see some obvious gills. There's our terrain model. Pale equals high altitude, dark equals low altitude. And then we can derive our gill index from that. So we take slope, divide it by distance from the streams. The red areas are the gills, the yellow areas are the gill edge, and the green areas are not gills. And it's a fuzzy model. It's not either or. It's a continuum, if you like. We can then classify those into paw gills, peripheral gills, and borders above, on that edge of that break of slope, if you like. And we did this because we were looking also at some fairly low relief areas and some very high relief areas. And so it was necessary to think about it in these terms. We then did a thing called a sky view factor. And the diagram's on the right there. Imagine if you're stood on a hill slope and you've got a hemispherical dome of sky above you. How much of that dome is sky and how much of it is the hill slope? And that, if you can mainly see sky, then you're above the break of slope. If you're in these dark areas down inside the gills or the deep valleys, then mainly we're low down in a deep valley. So it's quite a useful way of defining above break of slope. It's not a perfectly crisp model, but as you can see, there are different shades of grey here. But we're then able to sort of reclassify that into these pink areas which are above the break of slope. Subtract the areas which are not suitable for ground nesting birds for whatever reason, and these blue areas, they're above the break of slope. We've taken away unsuitable land cover, existing woodland, built areas, open water, and the slopes are less than 8 degrees. There's a sort of a target model, if you like, of areas which are potentially suitable for ground nesting birds. We then had, we took what's called a VOM model. It's a vegetation object model. It's tree height, essentially. And with the tree height data, we're then able to work out the existing avian predator overlay. And so, this spectrum here from red to green shows us high, medium, and low predator shadow, taking tree height into account. The next step was then to say, well, where can we see an object, a tree that's 10 meters tall from existing areas of potentially important for ground nesting birds? And these blue colors, high, medium, and low. And then when there isn't any colors, that's where you could have a 10-meter tall tree, which wouldn't provide an avian overlook on areas important for ground nesting birds. So that's your kind of final model, if you like. And then we're able to overlay the gill network on that and say, well, these red core areas, these are gills, which you have a 10-meter tall tree in it, it wouldn't provide overlook. And the green areas are those peripheral gills. So there we go. That's our model. And it's an attempt, as I say, to address this potential conflict between protecting ground nesting birds from avian predators and meeting our obligations under COP15, Coming Montreal Agreement, 30% of degraded landscapes restored, 30% protected for high biodiversity nature, and the local nature recovery strategies, etc., etc. So it feeds in potentially into those strategies. So that's a sort of a run through our model. But, at the end of the day, I just sort of think about this in terms of, yes, we can look spatially at these potential conflicts, but at the end of the day, there are some underlying causes. And I think there are potentially some associations between game bird releases in and around our moorland areas, encouraging overabundance of mesopredators. And I know correlation doesn't prove causation, but there's a strong correlation there between buzzard population abundance and pheasant population abundance nationally. And okay, there's been a few papers here on this. There's a paper by Pringle, and then there was a follow-up paper by Swan et al. Saying, well, okay, like most things in ecology, it's not that simple. It's always complex and context specific. So I'd just like to leave this with some questions of my own, if you don't mind. And I would say, well, these are questions which are always going around in my head, and say, well, can, careful targeting of native woodland regeneration, not conifer plantation, but deliver benefits for nature and ecosystem service delivery without impacting on ground nesting birds? I think the models that we've been looking at there say that, well, we can certainly use the geography to our advantage here and do some careful targeting, right tree, right place, etc. But then my other questions are really about, does management for a suitable surplus of grouse and large numbers of breed and release game birds encourage artificially high numbers of mesopredators? And I think the answer from listening to the previous Curlew and Predator webinar in October 22 seemed to suggest that is the case. A lot of the people were saying that yes, that is the case, or is likely to be the case, but ecology is complex. Do these then potentially create a spillover predation effect on ground nesting birds, particularly around the moorland fringe? So what I'm saying there is, yes, predator control can assist ground nesting birds, but at the same time, it's treating a symptom, not a cause. Is the cause an over supply of prey for mesopredators just creating a spillover predation effect? And there's only one way to prove this, and I think is to look more detail at some of the data. And so there's a plea here to the GWCT to make data on game bird releases, spatial data and temporal data, and on lethal predator control public available. So I'll leave it at that.
Steve, thanks very much. And I'm having huge. I imagine there's lots going in the chat and the Q&A, but as I'm on my phone, I can't access it. So still working on that. So I think what we'll do, without any further ado, is go to David.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Steve. That was really interesting. The gill planting model sounded really interesting and really like a good practical tool. to address an important challenge. Okay, so I basically just thought, okay, what can I meaningfully or usefully say in 10 or so minutes about a topic which I think we've all talked about an awful lot, and there's an awful lot that's been said about predators and curlew declines. The Rise of the Mesopredator was a paper from about 15 years ago, which kind of really flagged up this issue as a wider challenge facing global biodiversity, or biodiversity in lots of different contexts and lots of different places in the world. And this sentence really stuck out at me. Mesopredator outbreaks are causing high ecological, economic and social costs around the world. And in curlew conservation, I think we're kind of, to some extent, at the front line of that challenge of dealing with mesopredator overabundance. And I think, there'll be lots of people watching who work in curlew conservation, and once the breeding season starts, are dealing with the consequences and trying their best to kind of solve or address the challenge of an overabundance of foxes, crows, potentially badgers as well. And I think a really important question which we often ask ourselves, we often talk about, and I think Steve touched on there, is why do we have so many mesopredators? What's driving this effect, which is not just a UK effect, it's Europe, and it's across the world. And I think that the key things that we need to think about are the supply of food to mesopredators and agricultural landscapes, really across Western Europe and into sort of southern Fennoscandia and out into Eastern Europe. Agricultural landscapes are able to support really high densities of prey species. We know this from kind of lots and lots of data sets. Rabbits, hare, deer, geese, wood pigeons, rooks, pheasants as well in the UK. And there are also many other additional food sources provided by agriculture, livestock, grassland management, tillage, all provides easy and cheap food sources to mesopredators. And then there's all kinds of other ways in which human infrastructure provides advantages to mesopredators. And then the flip side of that is that the top-down control elements, which if we went back to the early part of the 20th century in the UK, okay, we wouldn't have apex predators, but the effect of really, really cold winters and obviously the effect of lots and lots of predator control all across the landscape up to the mid 20th century. The absence now of cold winters and widespread predator control are both really, really important factors in the recovery, as Steve showed that trend line for buzzards, for example. And the recovery of buzzards in the UK is really a consequence of them not being killed anymore. But also, I think we probably underemphasize the importance of warm winters in not regulating our mesopredator populations effectively anymore. And so the consequences for this, for the various ways in which we support mesopredators and the absence really of control mechanisms, are really, really serious, particularly for larger bodied ground nesting birds across Europe, of which curlew is the most obvious victim. We're probably all really, really familiar with what's happening to curlew all over the place, but it's really across Europe. The Dutch situation is pretty drastic for lots of species, and then across to Central Europe and Germany and Switzerland, there are really serious declines, and then even in, for example, southern Norway, lapwing populations have crashed. And it's really important to see that although these declines are driven by myriad factors, there's lots of things going on in all these different places, but one consistent problem is the predation of eggs and chicks. And so the problem that we're dealing with is very much, certainly it's Europe-wide, and to some extent it's just a global problem, but certainly in Europe we're very aware that we're dealing with an enormous problem, which is driven by all kinds of different factors, which are really, really difficult to understand. And the problem is only getting worse. We have, for example, raccoon dogs are an introduced species, and non-native species are causing problems right from Bulgaria up to Fennoscandia. Golden jackals are expanding across Europe as well, from the Balkans right up to Fennoscandia. That's a native species that are just, again, taking advantage of all kinds of opportunities, probably the suppression of wolves in Eastern Europe, and then the food opportunities right through Eastern Europe. And then right up into the Arctic, really interesting challenge to conservationists there is the spread of red foxes into Arctic tundra, and the challenges that presents both for Arctic foxes and potentially in the future for ground nesting birds. And similar patterns are being seen kind of across Fennoscandia, Siberia, where either red fox or corvids are colonizing new areas in response to changing weather patterns and either milder winters or new food opportunities. But it's not all totally bad. There are places where things aren't so bad. And I actually, can't remember now, maybe 2 years ago, spent a summer in Finland, actually met Mary and some of the Curlew Action representatives there. And the situation in Finland is actually reasonably rosy for various wader species, and it's really interesting to think about why that might be in relation to what's happening in lots of other places, but also be very cautious about what we can and can't say about the different ecological contexts. So to take a kind of a really a kind of a snapshot look at Finland, we can see that there's all kinds of differences between Finnish ecology and the situation in the UK, and also in terms of the way that species are managed. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to kind of want to just cherry pick aspects of other ecologies and sort of draw a link between what's going on here and there and say, well, it must be this that causes the difference, or it must be that causes the difference. And I just present this just to sort of make clear how challenging it is to look at two different ecological contexts where the predation situation is actually quite different. Like in Finland, curlew are stable by and large, and the lapwing population has actually expanded quite dramatically in recent years, whereas obviously in the UK things are not looking so rosy. But it's very difficult to understand and to kind of interpret what's driving those changes beyond some kind of simple things. Like we know, for example, that with lapwing in Finland, actually the snow melt has come a bit earlier in recent years, which has meant that lapwing are double brooded in Finland, or able to relay after nest failure, whereas that hadn't previously been the case, and that's allowed them to increase their breeding productivity. But with species like curlew and whimbrel in Finland, they're subject to much lower predation pressure, but really the factors that are driving that are really complex and related to probably everything that's on this screen to some extent. But whether manipulating one of these factors would alleviate or change the situation in either of these countries is very difficult to say. So to summarize very quickly, we're talking about a global conservation challenge, and it's driven primarily by human modification of ecosystems, habitats, and certainly climate as well. And it's really difficult to disentangle these challenges. And what that means is that the research to try and find out how we can perhaps ameliorate the effect of or ameliorate the drivers of meter predator abundance are going to take really a long time to get done, and it's going to be a really long process, I would imagine it. And so for the foreseeable future, we do have to accept that lots and lots of ground nesting birds populations will be dependent on interventions to reduce predation. So far, the evidence to suggest that there's other options to lethal control is relatively limited, but there's lots and lots of research going on to that effect at the moment, and so this certainly isn't this is the only thing we can do. But I think what's going on now is there's loads of research looking for other solutions, and I think I would say that I would like to end just on a few positives, because I think, having been involved in wading conservation for a long time now, I've been very aware of this problem and the severity of this problem, and to an extent have felt a little bit like there wasn't too much hope. But I think in recent years, there's a little bit more reason to be positive, just in terms of the changing understanding we have, and the fact that there are events like this where we can kind of talk quite sensibly about this type of issue. And yeah, there's just this growing awareness that this is a really big challenge which we have to sort of face head on, and that wasn't the case maybe a few years ago. And I think there's also loads of kind of really good and promising long-term research going on now on what's driving mesopredators. And that's across the conservation sector. GWCT, BTI and RSPB are all doing really interesting things on mesopredators and fox behaviour, badger behaviour. And for now, I think there is widespread consensus that lethal control is really important, but that might not be true in 50 years' time or in 20 years' time, when we have kind of other approaches maybe to deal that allow us to deal with this problem at a landscape scale. But I would say that the one thing that isn't too positive is that at the moment it's reasonable to say that current policies aren't sufficient to prevent weather declines, and this is a really important point to leave you with. Okay, thanks.
Really interesting. Thank you both, Steve and to David, for both those presentations. It is, I mean, I know you both agree, it is incredibly complicated situation, and there are some, if you like, some low-hanging fruits that we have to tackle. But the question is, how do we tackle them, and how do we decide what our priorities are in a situation that seems to vary place to place so dramatically? You mentioned Finland, David. Curlew Action, as you said, we met in Finland, which was great. I've put a link to the blog that we did from that in the Q&A part of the chat. So we can immediately see that there is some disagreement about predators, and in fact there is a lot of disagreement about what we do about predators, and it is one of the situations in conservation which does get people quite het up and worked up about, and people do get very emotional about what we do about predators, because it does often involve killing other creatures, and that's a very difficult subject to talk about. So without further talk, I'm going to hand over to our final speaker tonight, Alexandra Zimmermann, who specialises in looking at these conflicts in conservation. So I'm going to hand over to you, Alexandra. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thanks, Mary, very much for that. But yeah, I guess what you're alluding to there is that there's a whole lot of social element to all of this, and the previous two talks were really fascinating and kind of looking at the science of it. I learned a lot there. So I'm gonna completely go into the social side of it now, if that's okay. So I'm Alex Zimmermann. I've worked on human-wildlife conflict for a long time, 25 years-ish. So I chair the IUCN specialist group on human-wildlife conflict, and I'm also based at Oxford University and professor there. I'm working on conflicts and coexistence. And so I was invited, thank you very much, to join this to just share a few thoughts on kind of making sense of what you alluded to, the complicated kind of conflicts we see. And so I have worked all over the world, and least of all in the UK. So I'm actually going to give you some examples from other parts of the world, but I think you will see parallels there because so much of it applies here too. So it's all about this kind of wider conservation aim of trying to live in harmony with nature, as we've got in the global in the Convention of Biological Diversity. That is, no one would dispute that. That's a nice goal. It is, of course, extremely difficult to achieve. Frankly, it's pretty much full of disharmony, everything from the kind of habitat destruction and all the dilemmas you've got here as well with land use, to classic human-wildlife conflict, to all sorts of emotional debates on these conservation issues. And so what we've got really is kind of three classic types of conservation conflicts that we see all over the world. And the first is around access to areas, access to protected areas, or in this country, access to who gets to use the land in what way. And that is very, very much all about access, about equity, about benefits, who benefits, and so on. The second really classic conservation conflict that we see everywhere, and we see it here, is around hunting. My pictures and example here are around, of course, the famously difficult issues of trophy hunting. But even if it's hunting for sport or any kind of other hunting in other parts of the world as here, these are conflicts that are deeply about different kinds of values and beliefs, and it gets very, very emotional, and that's what makes it so difficult to tackle. And then when we get into human-wildlife conflict, that's the kind of classic situations you see in the UK as well from time to time. They can be practical issues, but they can also become all about politics and identity, and they can become deeply polarized. So wolves are the classic example in North America and in Europe, where these conflicts are not very much about the wolf. They're all about different groups of people who are in complete disagreement with each other and deeply divided. And so I guess really the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a kind of this human nature, this social aspect to these conflicts, and there's a absolute limitation to how much we can resolve this just with rational argument, with data, with arguing over what is right or wrong, and trying to put technology to work. This is where we hit the limit. And so we have this complete mess of things going on, and it's easy to kind of be tempted to think we need to, if there's a other party in the conflict, they need to be educated, or their awareness needs to be raised, or we need to present facts. That works when it's a fairly simple argument, when it's an argument about facts. But these conflicts, they really tend to be a bit like icebergs. There's a lot more going on underneath, and sometimes so much more that you have to dig very far to figure out what is going on there. So what we see human-wildlife conflict-wise is this is a problem in all countries. What's interesting is that, you know, it doesn't really matter how big or small the species are that are involved. You can get deeply polarized and quite toxic human-wildlife conflicts, even if you don't have really dangerous animals to live with, like elephants and carnivores. And so what we tend to think when we want to look at how do we resolve a conflict what appears to be with wildlife, the thing is that they're actually almost always conflicts about the wildlife. So there are conflicts between different groups of people about what should be done. And that's key, because that changes very much how we approach it. So we have to, it kind of needs a different, a shift in thinking. So we're seeing, I mean, what we're hearing in this webinar, and then seeing all over Europe also, is the return of carnivores of all sizes and shapes, and particularly wolves, lynx, bears, and so on. And this kind of conservation success is now bringing about increased problems over different groups of people having very strongly different opinions about what should be done about this. Not only in this part of the world, but we're seeing this in tiger range also. Huge push to bring back tigers. That is going to cause conflicts. Gyr lions and wolves in other parts of the world too. So this is kind of a common pattern going on. So why is it then, that I want to get into very briefly, that some of these situations seem to be resolvable with facts and debate and science, and some really seem to be going nowhere with that? And it's basically, here's one kind of thinking tool that explains it a little bit. Basically, we think of, in conservation conflict theory, we think of there being 3 levels. And you can have conflicts about a conservation issue that are really about the practical issue. So something has been damaged, or there's disagreement about how something should be handled, and it's fairly superficial. We call that a level 1. But quite often what's going on underneath is all sorts of history that has built up over time, that's causing resentments, that's causing all sorts of tensions. And it's often about expectations having been not met and issues not satisfactorily resolved. And that can fester and go on and become very intractable. And then you're talking about what in the peace building world would be called an identity-based conflict. So these are deep-rooted. They're about total polarization between key groups of people, and they are deeply about clashing identities and values. And so what's going on there, I'll skip through this a little bit quicker, but there's really classic symptoms of these things. So just looking at the lower levels, if in dialogues or in the discourse or on social media, there is really a sense of kind of really deeply negative or polarized language, really hostile. If there's a refusal to come to the table to discuss things, expectation that it's your wildlife or your land or you've got to fix it, exaggerations, frustrations are being expressed, then you've got a very clear sign that this is not a practical issue that you can solve with data and science, frankly. And so what I'm seeing all over the world is that there's a lot of, I suppose because a lot of conservationists, a lot of people working in conservation, a lot of institutions come from science, natural science backgrounds. So there is a real wish to try and fix these things with knowledge, with education, with rational argument. And so we tend to overly treat these situations as if they were level one, as if they were practical issues. The problem is the vast majority of them have deteriorated into social conflicts, and they need completely different approaches, basically. And what those approaches look like is that if you are dealing with just a practical problem that needs a practical solution, then the sort of negotiating between parties works, and it's all about figuring out clever ways and to find a solution to what seems to be an incompatible goal. And this is what we see a lot in human-wildlife conflict. So the sort of deterrence and the methods and the ways to try and reduce damage. That works if it is level one. However, if the relationships are damaged, then this needs entirely different approaches. Then we're looking at needing mediation, professional mediation, third parties there to help. And this is now all about kind of repairing relationships or building relationships. And that takes on a much higher volume of the work than just looking at the practical issues. So this is about letting the different parties be heard, addressing some of the history and so on. And if in worst case scenario, you're actually dealing with what we call level 3 conflict, deeply divided, polarized, identity-based issues, that's basically the same as what I just said, but in a much longer process. It's what in peace building would be called reconciliation. So it's a very long up and down process of rebalancing decision-making, power, and all that kind of thing. Again, this needs third-party mediation, often multiple mediators. And that looks a lot more like this. So basically, I'll stop there. So just a quick bit of background, if anyone wants to know more about kind of human-wildlife conflict resources, this specialist group has tons and tons of resources. That's the URL there. One of those is these guidelines that we came out with a year and a half ago. So this is the Human-Wildlife Conflict Global Guidelines. That's pretty comprehensive. If you are interested in that topic, feel free to download those. And then just to mention also, increasingly, I'm seeing that there's so much need for these dialogue, helps with understanding these conflicts, making sense of them, coming up with a strategy, building skills and so on. So I've recently created an organization that specializes just on that, because there seems to be increasingly a need for that, including in the UK. So I'll stop there and leave you with some contact details of anyone who wants to chat there more, and back over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Alexandra. That was really very, very interesting. Thanks so much. So we've heard from our three presenters about where we are at the moment with predator control, or one aspect of where we are at the moment with, is predator control necessary for ground nesting birds? So I just want to, Steve, just a question for you. Do you agree that we do need some level of predator control to protect oyster catchers, curlews, lapwing in certain places. Would you agree that, or do you think
Yes,
that
I
we
would say
should
so.
be able to do it all through habitat management?
No, I think you know, like right tree in the right place, you know, it's incredibly context specific. So I think there are places where, you know, predator control is going to be required, at least in the short term. But, you know, I do stand by my hypothesis that if we don't treat the cause, you know, we are on a decline, you know, we're swimming against the tide. You know, predator control is only treating the symptom of, you know, what David was talking about, and, you know, ultimately it is what Alexandra was talking about in terms of those issues there about conflict resolution. But, you know, if we don't treat the cause, which is creating a landscape which is ripe for these artificially high numbers of mesopredators, be that through mesopredator release or be it through, you know, availability of prey, you know, whether that's live prey or carrion or whatever, then I think you know, we're fighting a losing battle here, even with, you know, large amount of predator control.
So you're saying that there's large numbers of mesopredators, not simply because of game birds, but there are many other factors.
No, there are many other factors. Yeah, I mean, I raised that one there because I think, you know, we're talking about, you know, in the context of what we're talking about here about moorland edge. But yeah, there's a whole slew of other factors which are affecting mesopredator numbers, you know, not least of which is mesopredator release that David talked about. But also just general agriculture and you know, not being careful with our waste and a whole bunch of other things. You know, it's a complex picture and it depends very much on where you are. But you know, I simply don't have the data to sort of, you know, that I would love to have. Please, Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, if you're listening, you know, like to have that to explore that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks. And David, coming to you, in terms of the number of factors, and you raised a whole series of factors to do with mesopredator abundance, where would you put how important would you put predator the effect of predators on, say, birds like curlews? Would you put it right at the top of the drivers that are declining, causing the declines?
Yeah, I think I would, but I think it's really important to caveat that with the fact that predation is almost always the kind of the proximate cause, but there's so if we increase the amount of woodland in the uplands, then this maybe this creates denning sites, it creates nesting sites for crows, whatever, and whether we call that driver predation or woodland or spatial planning is actually I suppose it's important from the perspective of how we frame issues and from how we deal with issues, but it could be any one of those issues, but certainly I think that, yeah, I mean, I think for me the issue is that it's a really enormous problem, and I don't think we really understand when we say let's deal with the causes of mesopredator abundance, let's treat the cause rather than the symptoms. I'm not sure we totally understand just how deeply rooted and how pervasive and how difficult to shift the things that cause high mesopredator numbers are. I think if we're talking about changing something so that we don't have such high mesopredator numbers that, let's say, ground nesting birds can breed productively in lots of different places, I think we're talking about completely reshaping the landscape and countryside of the UK. And so I think that means if that is our goal, it's a really long-term vision. And what that means is that we do need to say, okay, that's our big ambition and that's a big vision. We're going to have to take everyone with us. So we're not going to have to be going about casting blame at different people for what's happened so far, because that's not going to work. And the second thing, I can't remember what my second point was. Yeah, no, there was something else, but I've forgotten it.
Yeah, so I totally I see what you're saying, that it's almost like extracting eggs from omelets, isn't it? Just saying, you know, we'll just deal with the predator issue and separate it out from everything else. Because as we know at the moment, and I'm sure you know, Steve, as well, that the agricultural subsidies that we're going into post-Brexit, you know, are not prepared to deal with this issue. It's just such a big issue. And so it looks to me, I don't know if you both agree with me, that if we can't get agricultural subsidies and help the land managers of this country do what needs to be done to make the country more balanced, then we are looking at predator control into the long term. I don't see there's a other solution to that. Do you agree with that? You go first, Steve.
Well, an element of, as I said, you know, it's complex, and it is context specific. I go back to that, and somebody more clever than me said once that, you know, ecology isn't more complex than we think; it's more complex than we can think. You know, and I think, you know, David's just highlighted a few examples there of, you know, and Alex in her talk as well, you know, just highlighted the crossovers between ecology, economics, and culture. Society just makes for, you know, a really wicked problem. And I think, you know, if we can, you know, address some of the causes, and I'm not saying we can address them all, but if we can address some of the causes, then surely that's a good thing. Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet here, you know, unfortunately. And I don't think continued predator control is that is a silver bullet in itself. Yes, it may well be required in certain locations, but you know, I think just looking at the current trends, you know, we are swimming against, you know, it looks like a losing battle. However, I mean, having read your book, Mary, you know, you do make the point that, you know, I think land use changes, those wider land use changes, you know, whether that's post-war or, you know, post-Brexit or whatever, do affect the fortunes of various species, including ground nesting birds, including curlew, you know, by making these landscapes of affordance for individual species, you know, which, you know, exploit niches. And so, you know, taking 3 cuts or, you know, 2 or 3 cuts of silage off fields which were, you know, favoured by ground nesting birds is not doing them any favours. And so, yeah, I think we do need to take into account some of these factors, you know, and again, it's a complex geographical, ecological, social, cultural and economic problem.
Yeah. And David?
What was the question again, Mary?
I was saying that because it's so complex, because there's so many factors involved in it, and because it looks like our agricultural mechanisms, our prescriptions post-Brexit are not really geared up for ground nesting bird survival, so to speak. It looks like predator control is here to stay. It's not a short-term fix. It looks like we're probably going to have to do it for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think I mean, just in terms of the research to try and untangle the various drivers of high mesopredator predator numbers, and then trial large-scale solutions, and then kind of report on that, and then is a really long-term process. And it's so in terms of kind of alternative solutions, or kind of the kind of in terms of like reshaping agriculture, reshaping the wider landscape, reshaping how, you know, how people do things in the countryside, that's a really long-term vision. And it's also one that obviously needs support, the support of the people who are going to be actually doing it. It's no use a bunch of researchers saying, right, okay, livestock farming has to be like this from now onwards, because that's not going to get any traction whatsoever. And so that the process of kind of potentially finding some way of kind of collaboratively redesigning or reshaping how agriculture is done, such that there's space both for ground nesting birds and and also for people to do things as they want to do it, is an enormous challenge. And it absolutely might be the case that there's effectively no solution, and that predator control is just going to be the solution. There's no reason why we should be able to solve this on an island with 50 million, 60 million people, whatever. Where the landscape is used in all sorts of different ways. It's not obvious that there will be a solution which doesn't involve predator control.
Mm. And before I come to Alexandra, just a question again for you both. We know that foxes and crows are two of the major predators of eggs and chicks of waders, not just curlew, but all waders. But we are increasingly seeing evidence for buzzards and red kites and badgers as well. And now we're into a very different kind of scenario, because these are creatures that are recovering from persecution, and they are affecting the landscapes that they are developing into or growing into, so to speak. So how on earth is that yet another really complicated factor that's thrown into this whole complicated mix? Is it just making it even more difficult, or is there a case for just saying we're just going to treat all the predators that affect ground nesting birds in the same way? What do you think, Steve, to that?
Again, tricky question. Again, you say looking at the causes for the increases in those avian predators as well. I mean, yes, some of it is less persecution, although it still goes on, and some of it is those species being encouraged, or having landscapes of affordance, by they're adapting and thriving on the conditions that they find in the landscape today. There's plenty of prey around, whether that's rabbits or bulls or whatever, or game bird releases. Let's not beat about the bush. So yeah, I think it's a tricky one. If there wasn't 60 million plus game bird releases into the countryside every year, would things be different? And maybe we're preempting the discussion here, but do we want to throw climate change into the mix? Because we've just finished a piece of work for a national park in England. I can't say much because it's not public yet, but under RCP 8.5 and business as usual SSP2 scenario, things ain't looking pretty. And so yeah, we probably do need to consider that at some point this evening.
What about these protected species that are?
I think, yeah, I mean, I personally think we need a really pragmatic approach. I think if we want to get good outcomes for ground nesting birds, then the difference in terms of the lethal control of badgers and the lethal control of foxes, if they both have an impact on ground nesting birds, they're both abundant. The fact that badgers are recovering from persecution isn't relevant to the conservation question that we're faced with today in terms of the decline of curlew and napping. And I think there's a sense in which, as a conservation sector, we have to bring whether it's farmers, whether it's gamekeepers, whether people working in the sector, we have to meet them somewhere. And I think with the question of I think with raptors it's a bit different, because I think it's not such. I don't suspect there will be some predation on chicks in particular places where the landscape or the behaviours of the birds kind of means that they're abundant in areas where there are lots of chicks. But I think for me, there's really no reason now for badgers to be treated differently from foxes. It's a very complex legislative thing, and I'm not an expert on policy, but there's no conservation reason for controlling foxes and not controlling badgers when they both in situations where they both can have impacts on ground nesting birds.
Alexandra, can I bring you in now, just to get your take on the situation with waders? So we've heard both David and Steve talk about their approaches, and then the complexity that we've just mentioned, that badgers are known to predate waders as well, and yet badgers are recovering. They're very loved. We have a lot of culture behind badgers. We have a lot of strong feeling because of the badger culls you know, pro badger for many people, anti badger in much of the farming community. How on earth do we begin how do you begin to sort this out and take everybody along with you, which is what David said we need to do?
Yeah, exactly. And that was a really helpful comment from David, actually, because that's exactly the challenge. It's not for one kind of sector or party to decide here's what we're going to do when it's this much of a value laden and emotional issue. Taking everyone, and it is a wicked problem, certainly, and it's all everything coming together and convoluted. And it's about this tension to some extent of animal welfare, animal rights, like versus kind of the rational species conservation, what makes rational sense. So when you have any kind of conflict that's sort of heavy in emotion and values and different histories and different kind of types of people and feeling threatened in how they live, and then you want to look at that for an entire country or a very large part of the country, it is too big, in my opinion. The stakes are too high for people to agree to try something. And so really what you would do, if I just go back to sort of peace building theory, you would break it down into smaller pieces. You might, when you have a really high stakes emotional tension like that, you would break it down, you'd come up with some sort of contingency agreement. So you'd work towards getting agreement with those who need to be involved and brought along, as you said, to try something in a small area. And I mean spatially small area in this case, for example. That is less threatening to all the parties involved. You might be able to get people to agree to give it a try, and if it doesn't work, then there's a way out for those who don't like it. And I think that might be the only way to go about this, to trying to do something. And this is why some of this, you know, policy, you can understand why policymakers, decision makers are a little on the fence on these issues, because going one extreme or the other is very high stakes.
Yeah. And we had a situation like that. Maybe either of you could tell the audience a situation a few years ago where there was a sort of valley in Scotland, as I remember it, where it was suggested that ravens were controlled because they'd grown in number in this area and ground nesting bird numbers were falling, and ravens were thought to be a major predator of them. And it was suggested that they had a trial cull, I think, over 3 years. Or 3 or 5 years, and there was a major outcry, absolute major outcry, which accounted for it being totally abandoned. Have I got that? My memory served me right on that one, David and Steve. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was more or less spot on. Yeah, it was in Strathran. There was an application to Nature Scott or SNH, maybe as it was then, to cull ravens to trial the culling of ravens for the preservation of ground nesting birds. And subsequent to the license being granted, there was lots of outcry about the granting of the license and the terms by which the license were granted, and the license was then subsequently revoked.
Yeah, it's my recollection. Yeah, I think one of the issues there is, again, it comes back to the nature of the species in question. Corvids, especially ravens, are incredibly intelligent for a bird, and so people, Alex probably agree here that people associate more with them than, let's say, I don't know, with sparrow or something. But yeah.
How much do you think there is an issue in predator control to do with the class system in Britain? So I know this is a big controversial thing to raise, but many of the, hunting, shooting, the shooting fraternity tend to come from the sort of upper classes. Do you think there is a class element that makes this, again, a more difficult issue to sort out that probably isn't the same in other countries? Anybody want to tackle that big thorny one?
Alex, go on.
Oh. I don't. If I compare with other countries, it's not where there is less pronounced class. There are always different sectors of society, sort of different identities. So, and that's not class. That's about farmers or landowners versus other people. Or it's political. It's, if you think of some of the U.S. conflict over wildlife, and by the way, I'm not American despite the accent. It's often Republican landowners versus Democrat city dwellers, that kind of thing. So that's not got anything to do with class. So maybe that's a little misleading here, but of course it's so pronounced in this country where there's so much history of it that it does seem to factor in.
David? I'm not letting you not get away with answering that one.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I honestly don't have anything particularly controversial to say. Yeah, I don't know. I think there are obviously kind of identities and groups and kind of people's values coalesce within those groups, certainly. But I don't know whether there's to what extent there's kind of either I don't know, like some kind of element of class warfare. Perhaps there is, but I don't think it's necessarily central to the whole thing.
Well, again, I'm coming at this from a sort of landscape ecology perspective, geography, etc. But there is rather top-heavy land ownership model in the UK, Scotland as well. Well, say UK, I mean England, Scotland, Wales. Certainly in terms of Scottish sporting estates and in terms of land ownership in England. So, I often talk about the land, wealth, power nexus. If you're a large landowner, you're obviously wealthy and you have a seat at the table. When it comes round to, to some extent defining or deciding what happens to land, and it's one of the primary reasons for owning land is to make it pay. Make it wipe its face. And quite often I hear the 3 Ps mentioned, people, profit, planet. And, I quite often turn that around and say, no, you've got that in the wrong order. It's planet, people, profit. No planet, no people, no profit. And so, I think there is an element of that to it. And, let's not beat about the bush. Grouse shooting is not a cheap hobby. All that goes with it. So yeah, I think some people do see it in that kind of light. I've tried to write objectively about shooting and rewilding, for example. I wrote a piece in shooting farms a few years ago, yeah, it's tricky. When you're dealing with some of those undercurrents. So I don't think we can ignore them, but yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I think it's another complicated factor, particularly in the UK, I think, and probably more so in England than any of the other nations, that there is an element of that which makes it even more complicated, as far as I can see, that we do form culture wars very easily. And that makes the solution, as you say, Alexandra, it's not just a matter of presenting facts, it's a matter of understanding the points of view of the different people that are involved in this. And there's such a wide array of people involved in the outcomes of this. We've got some interesting questions coming in on the chat, which I'll just say, and I'll just throw them out there. Is the problem, and I hear this a lot, that we just don't have enough top predators? That if we did reintroduce wolves and bears and eagles, then the mesopredator issue would be a lot less and everything would be much more in harmony. Can I start with you, Steve, on that one?
Yeah, I suppose you could. I mean, for my sins, I'm co-chair of the IUCN's rewilding thematic group. So yeah, I have some skin in this game. And there was a recent paper came out of Leeds University, from my colleagues looking at wolf reintroduction in the Highlands and what that could do for carbon sequestration. But yeah, by the by, yes, I mean, yes, the mesopredator release problem is there, as David described. I don't think it's a silver bullet, just simply reintroducing wolves and lynx and what have you into our landscapes. I think they should be there for other reasons, but not least because of we exterminated them and in the past, and we are signatories to the Berne Convention, which requires us to at least consider the feasibility of their reintroduction. So yeah, I look across at the continent and think, well, why are we any different? Why should we be different? Yes, we're an island, but we're not necessarily quite a small island, the 7th largest island in the world, and we're only 20 miles away from the largest landmass on Earth, the Eurasian Africa continent. So I think there are some good reasons why we should consider it, but I don't think, redressing the balance in terms of mesopredator release might be one of those reasons, but I don't think it's the only reason.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be aware that sort of apex predators have recovered to some extent or recolonized some areas of Europe concurrently with the wave of population crashes which we've seen across Europe. So I think it's not that you need kind of fragmented small apex predator populations, which would be what we would have in the UK, because the habitat wouldn't presumably, perhaps wolves would just live, would presumably just live wherever and eat whatever, but lynx or bears, for example, would be very, very scarce because the habitat wouldn't be there, and so we wouldn't have ecologically meaningful populations. And the thought of kind of reintroducing wolves with all that would entail, in the hope that it might have a response in curlew populations, is a little bit ridiculous. It might help a little bit, but that's not a curlew conservation mechanism that makes sense, just because it would cause fury and it would make curlew conservation very unpopular. So it's
I think lynx is more of an easier animal to live alongside. I think there is parts of the UK which would quite readily accept lynx. I mean, I was at a conference last month where they were showing some GPS collar data for lynx around the Harz Mountains, and they're quite happily existing in agri landscapes, agri-urban landscapes. It's really just a question of us living with those animals and learning to coexist with them. But I think again, evidence from the continent shows that a large portion of lynx diet are foxes, so intragill predation. So yeah, I think there are some wins there to be had. But yeah, wolves, it's a sort of a stretch to think that they're going to be a good tool for curlew conservation. But they are generalist in terms of the landscapes that they can live in, as shown on the continent. I mean, Brussels, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Denmark, they've all got breeding wolf populations, even Luxembourg. It's not without problems, but you don't need large wilderness areas. Bear, no, probably not. But lynx, yes. Wolf, not before I'm pushing up the daisies.
Alexandra, having the larger gill predators back in the country, it kind of, to me, it's a double-edged sword, because in a sense it makes everybody think, oh, at least we're getting something back, we're putting back what used to be here, and that's actually a really lovely feeling that we're going back. But also it brings with it a lot of fear. We're wholly unused to living with big predators anymore, so it makes the situation even more complicated. Is that how you would see it, as a conflict resolution?
Yeah, it's obviously, and the lynx idea is so far off any kind of agreement. Let's not go towards wolves yet, please. Wolves are an extra layer of complicated. But this is so much about, it is true that when such animals have been gone from a space for a long time, bringing them back is a whole different kind of level of complication to them gradually coming back naturally, as you have seen. But even there, you know, as Stephen just said, on the continent, there's it's so much, there's a tipping point of just the tolerances. At first, there's a bit of interest in the carnivores there, but then there's a point where it all just tips over. And so I think the only way to even consider anything like that here again would be a very carefully designed process of co-decision making. That's the only way I can imagine that working. And even that is in no way guaranteed. The problem with that, and just to touch on something that was said earlier, I think I might have seen something in the comments, is that with any of these conflicts, if you have key stakeholders in it that do not want to resolve it, and that's, you know, kind of a difficult thing to say openly, but in conflict, sometimes some parties in it do not want it resolved, and they'll pretend they want it resolved, but they don't. And this is not pointing at any specific issue. This is like generally in life. And that just can't move forward, basically. There's nothing the most skilled mediation team can do if there are parties in the system that simply will block it forever and ever. So there are some really deep challenges here. Not to say that it's completely impossible, but definitely.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. How much do you think the environmental NGOs have a role to play in this, or have created some of the problem, in fact? Because for a long time you would have had, or you do have, some of the bigger environmental organizations who refuse to talk about predator control, and who are reticent about talking openly about it and the need for it and how much they do it and so on, for fear of upsetting the membership. Do you think that has been an issue, and do you think it's getting better? Steve?
Well, I see this from both sides, in that, you know, very large NGOs with very deep pockets, you know, playing to a particular song, if you like, appeal to certain sectors of the population. Others are less convinced. But you know, even the RSPB carries out lethal predator control. We know that. They're less candid about it, I think. But so yeah, I'd like to sit on the fence on this one, if you like.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think there probably still is a problem around how we communicate about predator control. I mean, the challenge, if let's say you're running social media accounts for a large environmental NGO, you're not necessarily going to be really au fait with the kind of the power imbalances between people carrying out predator control and people doing conservation, and that understand all the nuance. And if you run a social media account for a big ENGO, your metric is hits or retweets or whatever it is, and it's totally understandable. That's how it is. And I mean, I would say, I mean, I think it's changing. I think people who work within conservation NGOs and also the national conservation the statutory bodies are much more open and kind of clear and concise about when they're talking about predator control and predators. And I think there is more understanding of the issue. But I still think that I think we're probably all aware of kind of projects where we see a press release and predator control isn't mentioned, and then we think, well, yeah, but that's just because you've got that breeding success because you've got someone shooting foxes, or you've got a big predator fence around it. And I think we all see that, and we all kind of scratch our heads. But it's, I don't know, that's just kind of the nature of environmental communication to an extent, I think.
Do you find that a lot, Alexander, that there's a sort of, not a, dishonesty is not the right word, but a reticence to acknowledge the sort of whole picture, if you like, so that we keep people mostly on side? Do you think that is, am I being unfair on that one?
I think that's that is the case, but we can, I mean, organizations have their needs, their interests, their agendas, and they have a right to have their own needs and interests and agendas. And a different organization has maybe opposing ones, and they have a right to have that. So all and it's really, I think it's not for one to say, well, you guys have to be different. It's the whole system that we need to look at. And what I'd like to see happen is that all of the key organizations involved in such a system of conflict would gradually, if they could become better at having better self-awareness, how their organization is functioning in this social conflict space. And if they could become themselves better at, protecting their views and interests, but interacting with the others in a more constructive way. If not, and not pointing at one organization and saying they need to behave differently, it's all of them. If all of the key big organizations or players in a system can become better at that, can be more diplomatic, better at not escalating things, at being constructive. If each of them had internally, mediation skills, then I think that could maybe have a sort of effect of the whole thing calming down a little. It's a hypothesis. I don't know. It would be nice if we could try it, but that's what I would like to try and work towards.
I always think it's a very difficult message to sell, because what we're saying to everybody at the moment is, look, we're in a biodiversity crisis. Look, wildlife's disappearing everywhere. We've got to look after wildlife. And then the next minute we say, oh, but that fox over there, we've got to shoot it. It's a very, very difficult message for most people to hear and understand, because it is so complicated. Can we make it simpler, do you think? Or do we just have to roll with the hard reality of it all? Steve?
Yeah, no, as I said before, it's a complex problem. It's not complicated, it's complex, and in some instances it's chaotic. If you know that Sinafin network. So yeah, I don't think there are any simple solutions here. It's incredibly context specific. It's down to a whole bunch of interplays of factors, not least that we've got the economic and the social and the cultural thrown in there as well for good measure. So yeah, I don't think there are any simple solutions here. But yeah, we do need this to be honest, and probably stop using some of the bits of misinformation or disinformation we see flying around. Not quite as bad as some of the things we've seen in the news today, but yeah, there are some things out there which have been said which are untrue, and so yeah, we need to be careful about that.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if we are clear and concise and honest, then there is progress to be made. I do think that people change their views over time if you communicate, but communicate with humility and not kind of I don't know, too forcefully. But yeah, I think certainly in my career, people I've worked with for over a long period of time have changed their views. I've changed my view about lots of these issues over 10 years or so. So it's absolutely possible for people to change the way they see things, change the way they interpret evidence, and change their understanding of problems.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you all one last question then. Given that we've talked about the complexity of curlew conservation and the big role that predation has in it, and the different attitudes towards predation and how they can be quite conflicting and create a lot of heat, saying all that and looking at the situation we're in, do you think that ground nesting birds like curlews do have a bright future in the UK? I'm going to ask that very, very bold question. Steve?
I don't know. I wish I had that crystal ball, but we haven't touched on the climate change issue, I don't think, really properly. That's my biggest worry. As I said, we've done some research on that recently, and looking at the crafted GB models, these models using AI and expert knowledge to look at how landscapes may well evolve over the next 50 years. And as I say, under the high emissions scenario, business as usual, things are not going to be pretty. And so I do worry that we are just on a slippery slope. Bending the curve is going to be difficult. And so the 30 by 30 targets, we're not going to meet those, not in the next 5 years, but they're good targets to have. If, and it's a big if, we can pull out the stops, then yes. But so the other scenario we modelled was a low emission scenario, SSP1, green future scenario, and those models actually look quite optimistic, and future looks rosy. So if we can bend the curve and get to 2.6 and go down that green futures scenario, SSP, shared socioeconomic pathways, sorry, using jargon, and then yes, but the alternatives didn't look good.
We do have a webinar coming up on climate change later on.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but specifically in the predator context, given all the complexity, if we don't do something about predators, we will lose ground nesting birds. But the reality of doing something about predators is not at all obvious. David, do you think we're going to do it?
We'll go back to the point of saying, let's attempt to at least attempt to treat the cause and not just be constantly treating symptoms. Sticking plaster ain't working.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm an optimist necessarily, but I think it's probably quite likely that what's going to happen is over the next 10 or so years, we'll have kind of quite focused regional areas. We'll call them wader recovery landscapes or something like this, where we'll select some of the most important areas. And within those areas, if sufficient funding is obtained, then I think we would be able to do some of the things that Alexandra was talking about in terms of kind of building relationships, bringing people together and finding kind of collaborative approaches. And I think it'll be an enormous challenge. And I think that waders will disappear, or ground nesting birds will disappear from large parts of the UK where they are now present. But I would hope that in a kind of far restricted geographical scope, we could actually deliver a kind of probably it will be a mix of lethal predator control and other interventions to kind of reduce predator populations, which brings us into kind of sustainable equilibrium populations in those areas. What that will mean in a kind of national population, I don't know, but I think there is a route to kind of sustainable populations in quite restricted geographical areas where we kind of work really, really hard at bringing people together and delivering effective solutions.
And Alexandra, with a problem as complex as predator control and curlews, will we hold on to curlews, do you think, knowing what you know about it?
I mean, I can't add anything to those two expert and excellent insights and responses just now, so I'm just going to end this on a topic, on a positive spin for you. I think the fact that your organization exists and all of your research projects and your organizations exist, and that you care about this, and that you're having these webinars, and that you're engaging, and that you're open to the ideas of trying new approaches to this and looking at it holistically, I think that gives it a fair chance. So I'd like to see it that way.
That's a very nice positive end. Thank you ever so much, David, Jarrett, Steve Carver and Alexander Zimmermann. Thank you for joining us this evening. We've run a bit over, but we did have a few technical issues, which hopefully we will sort by the next one. But it's a topic we will just keep coming back to because it's not going to go away. and every year the breeding success of curlews demands that we keep looking at this topic and trying to find a solution. So I hope we've added a little bit more to the understanding of the complexity of the issue, but I would like to thank you as the panel very much, and for the audience for all your really interesting questions, which this will now be edited, and we'll write a blog on the basis of it. If we haven't answered your questions, hopefully that will appear in the blog. So thank you again, and on behalf of Curlew Action, we see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.